Happy Hump Day and hearty welcome to one and all. This is episode 81. Amazing, huh? Of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you all for joining me in this late afternoon here in New York. Still no rain. We're on day 4, no rain. Unbelievable. Jinx. But if you're checking out episode 81 on the YouTube channel and haven't done so already, please click like, subscribe, comment, turn on those notifications. Or if you catch episode 81 on the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same general rule applies. Click like, subscribe, turn on the notifications, and comment if you enjoyed or even if you didn't enjoy episode 81. So today is another on this day, but a little bit of a quirkier one, below the radar. But the central figure of this on this day is someone who is not below the radar, somebody who is really a giant of the comedy world and Hollywood, and he's a damn good musician on top of that, and book author, and that would be Steve Martin, who, much the same way that Kevin Costner has a new generation of fans, maybe people who weren't even aware, this guy used to be one of the biggest movie stars in Hollywood, with Yellowstone, and Danny DeVito, a whole generation of people always did, the father on It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. Steve Martin has a lot of Gen Y, Gen Z fans who know him. That's the old dude with white hair with Selena on Only Murders in This Building. And 33 years ago, Steve Martin wrote and starred in a comedy called L.A. Story, which was released in some areas midnight, February 7th of 1991. Technical release date would be February 8th. But 33 years ago, L.A. Story opened in theaters. And last week I discussed on a different, it was on Groundhog Day. And I discussed that movie on Groundhog Day. Now, just one of those weird things that the movie Groundhog Day was ready to be released, but for whatever powers that be, they did not literally release it on Groundhog Day. I always felt there was a little bit of a missed opportunity, but whatever. But the movies, although they're 2 years apart, and LA Story is just over, and when I say just, like days, 2 years older than Groundhog Day. But it's strange because the films do share parallels, one of them being two great comics. In the case of Steve Martin, he was a stand-up comic first. Bill Murray was more of just a genius sketch comedian than a conventional stand-up comic. Steve Martin basically was great at everything. There's nothing that he has not been able to do in the entertainment arena. But the two movies, and obviously Steve Martin hosted Saturday Night Live. Bill Murray became part of his rise to superstardom was because he was so good on Saturday Night Live. He and Dan Aykroyd both. It wasn't an accident. They ended up becoming friends. They ended up doing Ghostbusters because of the strength of their performances and, their own skills as writers, as creators, as concept people. In the case of Bill, his unbelievable ability to ad lib and just make crazy shit up on the spot, and somehow it works. But LA Story comes towards the end of Steve Martin's incredible, and I don't say this lightly, he had an incredible 5-year run, starting with a movie that it's kind of a culty film for my generation. It's called Three Amigos. I'm not really a fan. I was more of a Chevy Chase guy at that point than Steve, and Steve is, I guess you could say he's nominally the lead. Oh, and his Only Murders in This Building, his cohort there, Martin Short, is one of the Three Amigos. But I feel like Chevy got a lot of the, Chevy Chase that is, got a lot of the big moments in Three Amigos. It's okay. It's one of those where I could see this one being remade because it's like the concept is almost better than the execution. How three old school movie stars get mistaken they mistake real bandits, real bad guys for actors. And then the shit hits the fan. But Steve Martin, in this extraordinary stretch of 5 years, he had Three Amigos. He had what amounts to an extended cameo or a guest starring role in Frank Oz's remake of Little Shop of Horrors starring Rick Moranis. and Ellen Green, Vincent Gardenia. A really solid movie, kind of a musical, dark comedy horror movie, which was a box office hit. And he plays like a dentist, Oren Scrivello, DDS, who's basically a masochist. He's a narcissist, a masochist. He's so horrible, but Martin somehow makes the guy lovable just because we see it's Steve Martin, we know it's a movie, and like we want to like the guy. He's so terrible. He's so over the top, over the line, inappropriate, just reprehensible. But the performance is dynamite. And this is another one of those comedic supporting performances don't get nominated, or at least back then, he didn't seem to get the same, acclaim and discussion with the Academy. But Steve Martin, for supporting actor in that movie, he could have easily gotten a nomination. He's amazing as the dentist. I'm sorry, doctor. I'm sorry, doctor. There's Ellen Green, the way that she delivered her lines in that. But he turned around from Little Shop of Horrors, and he had 2 huge starring roles in 1987. Both movies that are beloved in different ways and for different reasons. His adaptation of Edmond Rostan's Cyrano de Bergerac, which cinematically is called Roxanne, I think it's it's an amazing film. It's a comedy, but it feels like so much more. And it was a movie that it used Daryl Hannah better than most films of that decade. Because Daryl Hannah was never necessarily the greatest thespian. She's not a great actress. She's somebody who looks good up there on screen. You know, Kill Bill, you could argue that was maybe the best work that she did as far as acting. Some of the scenes she had with Uma, supposedly the 2 women didn't get along, but the performances clicked. They matched when they were on screen. And, Daryl Hannah in Splash with Tom Hanks, very young Tom Hanks, she doesn't really do much with the role. Legal Eagles, I love the movie with Robert Redford and Deborah Winger, Terrence Stamp, love it. She's underutilized there. She just looks great. She's really hot. In Roxanne, she plays an intellectual, an astronomer, and her kind of hesitancy, her slightly off-kilter line readings, which she used to greater effect, for example, in Steel Magnolias, it works because her awkward pauses, the line readings that she used even earlier in the 80s in movies like Reckless with Aidan Quinn, it works in Roxanne. And Steve Martin basically plays Cyrano de Bergerac, C.D. Bales, not an accident. And he's a guy, he's got this big nose. That movie is really good. I don't know anybody. It's strange because I'm looking right now at the Internet Movie Database and the score is not that high. I have never met anyone who did not love that movie, who saw it. It's sweet. Rick Rossovich, another terrific performer from that decade, not a great actor, but a terrific performer who showed up in a lot of big movies. And Roxanne is arguably the most work that he did. He's almost, at certain points, the second lead. He and Steve Martin almost operate as a tandem for chunks of that film. But Rick Rossovich, he was in the Terminator, the original with Arnold. He's the guy who actually thinks that he's going to take the Terminator on hand to hand. Don't make me bust you up, man! And he plays, I believe it was the character of Slider in the original Top Gun. He's one of the shirtless, brigade in the famous beach volleyball scene in the original Top Gun, which led into a very, let's just say probing, if I may use that word, discussion in film school where the Professor Perez, fall 1995, was essentially, because we watched the movie Top Gun in film school in 1995, she was basically saying one of the best things that Top Gun does is it flips the gender roles, boop, makes it upside down. The woman who is usually the object of desire is wearing kind of manly type clothing. She's dressed in full uniform, and here you have these hot young guys running around 95% naked. Val Kilmer, Tom, Anthony Edwards, and Rick Rossovich, who was definitely more diesel and more of the sort of classic Abercrombie and Fitch looking dude than the other guys. But Rick Rossovich is really great. Roxanne is a successful film. I love what Steve Martin did there. He doesn't go the easy route anyway. The laughs are earned, and it's just a terrific movie. And Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, one of the best holiday movies ever. I mean, it's, as far as Thanksgiving films, easily top 5, maybe top 3. And if you just want to say kind of movies overall, that movie almost everybody also loves, but the IMDb score reflects it. It is a much beloved movie. John Candy, amazing. And in Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, another film which is very well liked with Steve and Glenn Headley and fantastic Michael Caine. So he's just knocking out one terrific film after another. And then he does Parenthood in 1989. Summer was a huge hit with an all-star cast from Jason Robards Jr., Rick Moranis again, and a young Keanu Reeves, Diane Wiest, who had won an Oscar for Hannah and Her Sisters, a young Joaquin Phoenix. Just an incredible, amazing all-star cast. And that obviously spawned the TV show. But Steve's character is the central figure in that film. He's supposed to be playing younger. It's the thing with Steve, his hair went gray very young. So the movie Parenthood, he looks like he's at least 50 to my eyes. He's playing a guy who's in his 30s. And Steve, I believe, was only 43 when that movie began filming. His hair just went gray. Shit happens. But Parenthood is fantastic. And then he did My Blue Heaven, which was a movie that was not necessarily that huge of a box office hit, also with Rick Moranis. Not that big of a box office hit, but it's also a cult film. And Steve, basically, this is one of those crazy bits of film trivia. It's an adaptation of the same book that was turned into Goodfellas. It was an adaptation of the memoir, which was called Nick Pileggi. That was the Henry Hill character, Wise Guy. And, let me just double check on the year of that. Wise Guy book, right, by Nicholas Pileggi. Yeah, Henry Hill. So basically it was one of those, I don't know if you would call it ghost written, because there are books where an author works with the principal, and the principal writes it with a little bit of help. And then there are other kinds of books where the principal will just kind of narrate and tell their story. It used to be on tape, and then they would go ahead and it was called ghostwriting, where it would mostly be, the idea was to try to capture the voice and the spirit of the real person. So like, for example, you're watching Goodfellas and you're hearing Ray Liotta as the real life guy, Henry Hill, telling his story. It sells it. But the character that Steve Martin plays in My Blue Heaven, which is the last film that he had that came out before LA Story, Vincent Antonelli, he is basically, if you could do a double feature with these two movies, Goodfellas and My Blue Heaven. For those who've seen Goodfellas, if you remember how it ends with Henry Hill, Ray Liotta, basically complaining, I get to live the rest of my life out here like a schmuck. He's in the witness protection program. He's living in Idaho or New Mexico. We don't know where the fuck he is. He's in the middle of nowhere. And he's in the middle of nowhere for a good reason, because the mob will hunt him down and end him and anybody he ever loved if they find him. The movie My Blue Heaven is set essentially just as the credits of Goodfellas would roll. And Steve Martin is playing the same character, but in a way more broadly comic interpretation. I've never loved the movie, but Steve's performance is dynamite. He's dynamite in that film. And Rick Moranis, of all things, plays an FBI agent, little Rick Moranis. But the movie, it's a film that I feel has aged very well. And people discovering My Blue Heaven now who didn't know the Goodfellas connection be like, holy shit, it's fucking brilliant. So all of that led to LA Story, which was released the first week of February in 1991. And after this unbelievable run, and Steve Martin had worked on the script of LA Story for 7 years. So he actually started writing it in the early 1980s when he did Pennies from Heaven, right in that range. And it's the kind of thing that he tinkered with, he played around with. As he continued working, he didn't have 100% of his focus on it. LA Story, Steve Martin plays a wacky weatherman. That was the other, when I mentioned Groundhog Day, that's the other parallel. There's the surrealist elements, but the fact that Steve plays a TV weatherman and Bill Murray, Phil Connors in Groundhog Day plays a TV weatherman. And both movies play with notions of reality versus fantasy versus a sort of surrealist ethic. And what would you do if trapped in this bizarre scenario? Now, the irony is, lots of Groundhog Day are set at ground level reality land. Very little of LA Story is set at ground level reality land. The movie shows itself within the first couple of minutes as absurdist farce. Like, okay, well, this couldn't happen. You have like a cardio park, an exercise park in Los Angeles, which is so absurd and bizarre. You say, okay, well, this right away, this is not in reality land. This is ridiculous. Although now there are parks that have a lot of cardio machines. Back then, it wasn't really done at all. But there's a scene on the LA freeway where people literally have rifles and machine guns and handguns, and they're shooting at each other. That happens in LA Story. So the movie, the surrealist elements of this film, the additional parallel to Groundhog Day where you say, okay, this can't happen in the natural world, is that Steve's character, who is this wacky TV weatherman, successful in his way, and he's not presented as a crank. He's not presented as an asshole who needs a comeuppance and needs to grow, as Phil Connors, Bill Murray's character in Groundhog Day. The whole point of him spending 100 years in Groundhog Day was that this was a man who had it in him to do great things, not just make money being a fucking TV weatherman and being a clown and treating everybody like shit. Steve's character, Harris K. Telemacher, is just a guy. He has a girlfriend played by terrific Mary Lou Henner, she of the unbelievable memory. She has one of the greatest memories, I'm not exaggerating, in the entire country. She can remember specific moments of specific days in her life. And Anderson Cooper kept trying to stump her. She actually had a book signing across the street from where I was in Huntington. Anderson Cooper was randomly throwing dates at her, and she was recounting what she did on that day, and it felt like it was canned, but it was not. There were too many people involved that said, no, that's how absurd, incredible her memory is, how preposterous. That Anderson Cooper says September 15, 1978, and she spends 5 minutes telling you her day on that day, which is insane. But Mary Lou plays his girlfriend, and a very young Sarah Jessica Parker plays another woman he gets involved with. Some great scenes, even her introducing herself. Her name is Sandy, but it's not spelled in a conventional way. She's a valley girl, and she wants to take him for a colonic. And Martin in that movie has a lot of fun with certain conventions and certain stereotypes, and he pokes fun at his own character because he comes out of this bad relationship, and Mary Lou Henner really doesn't treat him well. Yes, he's a little bit of an airhead. He's a bit of a putz. And he has a line which is unbelievable. You wouldn't get away with now, I don't believe. But he is hanging out. I forgot who he's with, but it's not just Mary Lou. There's a couple of other people in the apartment. And they basically ask him if he wants some juice. He says, yeah, I'll have some juice. And then he says, I can never be a woman. Why is that? I would just sit home and play with my breasts all day. I remember back then, it was like, whoa, he just said that out loud? He has this unfortunate situation. Mary Lou Henner's character is not treating him well. And then he meets Sarah Jessica Parker's character. And he doesn't sugarcoat it. He does not try to pretend that this is going to be some incredible love affair because they have no connection. She's this wacky valley girl type. He's a wacky weatherman, but this is not the same kind of wacky. She's a crazy, wacky valley girl. She spells her name Sandy, big S, small a, small n, big D, little e, big E, and then there's a little star over the second E. But she seems to like him. And as he tells the audience, why did I go with her? Because I was a big, dumb male. And what he's saying is, I know this isn't for long, but I just came out of a bad relationship, a bad breakup with someone I cared about. Again, in the world of this very, very strange, eerie, surrealist narrative. He comes out of this relationship, and this is a hot girl who wants to take my clothes off. I'm here for it. He's not making apologies, but he's calling attention to it in a way which I think is refreshing. It's not the sort of, I wouldn't have picked up on it when I was 17 or 18. But now I see it, and I watch scenes like that, and I say, man's being honest. And he meets a character played by Victoria Tennant, who was Martin's real-life wife at the time. And the story unfolds, but the real big, surreal, crazy shtick in the film, L.A. Story's version of Groundhog Day's time warp, where it's 6 a.m. in Punxsutawney for 100 years, and we're listening to Sonny and Cher sing, "I got you, babe. I got you." Steve Martin, while he's on, I believe, the LA freeway, there's a billboard, one of the old school electronic billboards. You still have them. And it's just an electronic billboard, but the electronic billboard that he passes all the time starts having messages that appear to be directed at him, Harris K. Telemacher, wacky TV weatherman. And the moments of Steve Martin standing on the side of the road, essentially arguing with what looks like a sports scoreboard, are some of the craziest shit you'll ever see in a movie. I mean, you could argue that that's even crazier than a time warp. He's sitting there, it's all like Tom Hanks yelling at Wilson! But that's not surrealist. That's a guy who was trying, not to lose his mind. But the movie, when it came out, I'll never forget this. I never thought of my father, may he rest in peace. I never thought of my father as necessarily a huge Steve Martin fan. He liked Steve Martin. He enjoyed Parenthood. He liked, Roxanne. But I never remember him being specifically a fan. There were certain people that Dad really was a fan of and would seek out their movies. But I remember he watched the commercial for the film, and it kind of, and he said, "Oh, we're definitely seeing that this weekend," meaning that he and his lady friend at the time. And I remember when he came home, he loved it. He said, "This is one of the funniest movies I've seen. I don't remember the last time I laughed so hard in a theater. It was hysterical." So the film came out. It ended up being a box office success. And Steve's performance, his turn, was fantastic. And to me, the most memorable single beat in the film is that Steve, 7 years to work on the script. It's a now somewhat famous scene where he's in a restaurant and he orders, well, first, one of the things is he orders dinner, and it's the kind of place where it's $300 a plate in 1991, and there's maybe 2 ounces of food. But he orders coffee. The scene was shot presumably in the middle of 1990. This whole scene is about people starting to have hyper-personalized coffee orders. This was not always a thing. And Steve Martin correctly predicted the future of hyper-personalized coffee orders in that scene where I'll have a decaf coffee, I'll have a decaf espresso, I'll have a double decaf cappuccino. You have any decaffeinated coffee ice cream? And then Steve's immortal line, "I'll have a half double decaffeinated half-caff with a twist of lemon," is from that movie. And not that long after, by the mid-90s, all of a sudden we were in a world where everybody had their own coffee order. And in the movie You've Got Mail, that's 1998, they were already talking in that movie about everybody having their own personalized coffee order. That did not exist. And Steve Martin, for all of the laughs, he was somebody who was paying very close attention to the world around him. He knew it was coming. It was inevitable. And so the movie, it actually sits at 91% on Rotten Tomatoes, which for that kind of comedy, out there, surrealist, absurdist, is a very high score. And not only was it a box office hit, but I remember there was a lot of chatter, Siskel and Ebert, but there was a lot of talk that this was already 1991. And 1990 had been a pretty strong year for movies. That's the year of Goodfellas and, Dances with Wolves, Reversal of Fortune, among others. But there was a lot of chatter that this was already the best comedy of the decade. Again, you only had a year and a month, basically. But there were people who loved it, really loved it. That this was not like any other comedy that had been out or was out, and not like any of his previous work. Sometimes had those sorts of surrealist and absurd elements, like in All of Me, that he did with Lily Tomlin. But in general, this was something different. And Steve had one more great movie in this incredible run of 5 years, because as I say, Three Amigos came out towards the end. I believe it was released in the final quarter of 1986. At the end of 1991, Steve Martin, for the first time in some time, quite some time, probably since Pennies from Heaven, if I'm not mistaken, which was early 80s, in a dramatic role. He plays a movie producer in Lawrence Kasdan's vastly underseen and underrated. Like, this is a movie that I hope the next generation of film geeks discovers, because it is fucking fantastic. It is a brilliant film. In the year of Bugsy, in the year of Silence of the Lambs, in the year of Oliver Stone's JFK, Beauty and the Beast, Terminator 2. Hasta la vista, baby. I swear I will not kill anyone. In that year, Grand Canyon holds its own with every other great film, in my opinion, from that year. And Steve plays, he's supposed to be Joel Silver. Joel Silver, famous movie producer. He was involved in Predator, Lethal Weapon. He made a lot of great movies. But he, at that era, the 80s into early 90s era, Joel Silver was, he used to kind of mock artistic pretension, that he thought it wasn't necessary. He used to say, I don't make art, I buy it. That was one of his great quotes. And he's not Joel Silver. His name is, I don't remember the name of the character. But he's clearly modeled after Joel Silver. And the movie is an ensemble story about life in Los Angeles circa 1991. You see Magic Johnson, the first iteration of Magic Johnson before his HIV diagnosis, and Danny Glover, who was coming off, at that point, had made 2 Lethal Weapon films. Fantastic as a guy who basically becomes, Kevin Kline's character's best friend, Mac, that's the name of the character. But Steve is kind of on the periphery of the story, and then he becomes more important to the story. And if you didn't know that, hey, this is Steve Martin, this is a comic, this is a guy who was a stand-up comic, the wild and crazy guy, a batshit insane stand-up comic who did stuff on stage. Like, people used to talk about Robin Williams doing shit that no one ever did. That's true. But nobody did some of the crazy stunts that Steve Martin pulled off. The way that he could make balloon animals that fast. He was a trailblazer and a pioneer himself. But in Grand Canyon, he finds the humanity in his character, even if his character is not really interested in making art. He has a life and death experience, which, even if it ultimately doesn't change him, Martin plays it so beautifully. He makes you feel it, and he makes you understand there are larger things at work here than me just making trash and making money. Now, maybe somebody will have that come to Jesus moment and then turn their back on it. But the way that he plays it, the gravity of his character in that film, it's a fantastic performance. Again, it would not have been out of place if he had drawn a supporting actor nomination. That is how solid he is in Lawrence Kasdan's Grand Canyon, which I should point out was a hit. And it was a kind of movie, there were certain major critics that said, we love Bugsy, we love Silence of the Lambs, which ended up winning all the major awards for movies released in 91. But they had Grand Canyon as their pick for Best Film of 1991. And it is a movie that I kind of got to a little bit late, because the first time I saw it, I was only 18 and it didn't work. I just wasn't mature enough. And that's sometimes how these things go, where there are movies that they hit us different depending on where we are in our life. And another one, also from 1991, that I should have mentioned as a great film, The Fisher King. I had the same reaction to Fisher King, which is Robin Williams, the late, great Robin Williams, with Jeff Bridges and Terry Gilliam. Kind of a comedy, kind of an adventure, kind of a buddy movie. But that was a film that the first time I saw it at home, sucked. Didn't like it. And the first time I saw Grand Canyon, I kept waiting for something to happen, not realizing that shit was happening the whole movie. But I was expecting a conventional narrative in both films. Watching both The Fisher King and especially Grand Canyon later in life, and I don't mean that much later, I mean more like in my early to middle 20s, not 18. Both films are touched by genius. Fisher King is touched by genius and madness. but Grand Canyon is simply touched by genius. It is one of the best films of its type, an ensemble movie starring a number of big stars in roles that, well, the role for Kevin Kline was kind of conventional, but Mary Louise Parker is in there, for her, a little bit of an unconventional role. Mary McDonnell was, soon to be an Oscar nominee for Passion Fish, which came out the next year. And Danny Glover and Alfre Woodard and Steve Martin. The poster is so good because it's like they told Steve Martin, don't smile. We don't want people to think it's Steve Martin in another funny role. He has a beard and he has his arms folded, and you can tell by the look on his face, okay, whoever he's playing, it ain't funny, because they wouldn't have that guy having that kind of face if this movie was a comedy. But that's the last film of this extraordinary 5-year run for Steve Martin, where almost everything he touched turned to cinematic gold, but he was grinding every one of those films, Dirty Rotten Scoundrels even, where you could sort of overlook the performance. He doesn't take any of those movies off. He is fighting and scratching for every laugh, or in the case of Grand Canyon, the dramatic moments. It's 5 years of cinematic wizardry, as far as I'm concerned. And the closest approximation to that, in my opinion, and this is the thing, that in general, when we talk Academy Awards, we talk Oscars, I know it's all political. I know all of this. I know the history. I don't know who won every Oscar in what year, but I understand that there has been political chicanery, and there's been a lot of weird years where it didn't make sense that so-and-so wasn't nominated, or how did this person win over that person. But in general, comedic performances are not judged the same as dramatic performances. And I named any number of Steve Martin performances which could have easily drawn Oscar nominations, because it's almost like when someone is that good, we take them for granted. And the parallel that I'll draw is another guy who hit his glory period in the 90s, Jim Carrey, who hit his peak. The beginning of his peak was the first Ace Ventura, which I discussed last week when it was the anniversary of its release date. Steve's career was already starting to kind of come down a little bit. Now, he was still a major player. I forgot. I'm sorry. Father of the Bride, the first Father of the Bride. That's the one movie I left out because it's not as good as most of the other ones I mentioned. That came out at the end of 1991. So Grand Canyon was in theaters, Steve in a supporting role, Father of the Bride, which spawned a sequel, again with Martin Short. When you work well with somebody, you keep working with them. How many times did Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau work together in their career? I can't even count offhand. Scorsese and De Niro, Scorsese and DiCaprio, Clint Eastwood and Jeffrey Lewis, Clint Eastwood and Morgan Freeman, that is. So Steve Martin, this incredible 5-year run, and even in Father of the Bride, it's not a very good movie. He's great. He's funny. The story is just okay. And Diane Keaton, love her. But Jim Carrey, from 1994 to 1999, I would argue had a stretch comparable to Steve Martin's sublime 5-year period, where Jim had Ace Ventura, The Mask, Dumb and Dumber, Batman Forever, Ace Ventura 2, The Cable Guy, which was not entirely successful, but he absolutely destroys it. Liar, Liar, not a great movie, but very funny. Jim ad-libbed at least half the dialogue, and somehow he made it work. And then the two extraordinary films, Truman Show in 1998, which it's unbelievable that it didn't do better at the Oscars. It was a movie that everybody loved. It got incredible reviews. It made a shit ton of money, and it was still somehow overlooked in the year of Saving Private Ryan and Shakespeare in Love. I really like Shakespeare in Love. But you can't compare that movie to Truman Show. I mean, come on. Truman Show runs rings around Shakespeare in Love. If the Academy, the powers that be, decided that, well, we're going to give Spielberg Best Director, but Private Ryan, we really don't want that bloody bloodbath. It's a bloody bloodbath, the first quarter of the movie. We don't want that winning Best Picture. I'm sorry. Under those conditions, there's no way that Truman Show should not have won Best Picture of that year if they were going to eliminate the Truman Show. Because as much as I enjoy Shakespeare in Love, I've seen it 5 times. It's fun, frothy. The whole cast is great, from Gwyneth, Joseph Fiennes, Ben on down, Tom Wilkinson, who just passed. Truman Show is a fucking masterpiece, and Jim is amazing in it. And then the next year, Man on the Moon, he's even better, playing a dual role. Andy Kaufman and Andy Kaufman's alter ego. How does that work? Tony Clifton, you've seen me wearing the shirt. Other than that, other than Jim Carrey's 5 years of excellence, nothing compares to what Steve Martin did. And working as frequently as he was, how did he find time to breathe, to take vacations, to take a rest? But every movie that I mentioned, from Three Amigos up to and including Father of the Bride, 1991, you see the gears turning, and you see Steve giving every role everything he has. And a little ashamed to admit, I have never seen an episode of There's Only Murders in This Building or Only Murders in This Building. I get Hulu. I normally don't watch episode television. And so many people have told me, bro, you're a Steve Martin fan. What the fuck are you waiting for? Maybe at some point I'll pick it up. I'm not anti-Selena Gomez. I should point that out. I think she's terrific. I've never bought, back in the day, I never paid for any of her songs or even downloaded. But I don't know. I just haven't gotten into it. And I guess when I do, I'll say, what the hell did I wait so long for? But it's all part of it, And nobody stays at the top forever. And a 5-year stretch like Steve Martin had is lightning in a bottle, where he kept picking great projects, or in some cases writing and creating on his own great projects and just knocking them all out of the park. But this has been episode 81 of the Confessions of a Not So Dangerous Mind podcast. I'd like to thank you for spending, now some of your early Wednesday evening with me for the Steve Martin episode. And if you checked out episode 81 on the YouTube channel, haven't done so already, click like, subscribe, comment, turn on those notifications. And if you caught up with episode 81 in the audio platforms such as Spotify or iTunes, same rule applies. If you enjoy the content, click like, subscribe, and turn on those notifications. I'll be back with episode 82 real soon. Till then, I'll have a half double decaffeinated half-caff with a twist of lemon.